Hello and welcome to the Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. I'm Reese Ryan and here with me is Nathan Ang. This week, our special guest is Latin American politics expert Wynand Kastart from the University of California, Irvine.
My word, Reese. I've been telling you a lot about my former professor, and I'm glad you were finally able to have a chat with Wynand with me. We speak with Wynand about what is going on in Bolivia, breaking down the upcoming elections, and what's going on with the embattled former Bolivian president, Evo Morales. But, beyond Bolivia, I didn't really have much of an idea of what was the political situation like in Latin America more broadly, as it's such a kind of foreign and faraway region for us that it was great for Wynand to paint a picture for us.
You're so right, Nathan. It absolutely was. And it was fantastic for you to reunite with Wynand again. You're just such a friendly guy who loves the people and a man for the big occasions. Like your job interview this week, we're in a group interview. You had to describe yourself in one word. And you didn't go with ambitious or analytical. You went with friendly. And I'm still shook about that. And that's why we love you though. You're just a man with his feet on the ground. And this week we felt like our feet were on the ground in La Paz. And I'm still grasping how pivotal this election is for the Bolivian people. So, let's get stuck in with another Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. Wynand, thank you for being with us today. I'm inspired by your story and how you fell in love with politics. But where did the Latin America and regimes and that admiration for studying all of this come from?
Yeah, so this was years ago. It was at a time when I became very disillusioned with domestic politics in a country in which I was born and raised, which is Holland, of the Netherlands. And I vividly remember how I decided to take a step back from studying domestic politics, because at the time, Dutch politics saw the rise of this right-wing politician, Pim Fortuyn, and everything was turned on its head at the time. And as I became so disillusioned, I decided to focus on other countries and other world regions. And I decided to focus on Latin America. Why? Because I thought that Latin American politics, that there was more that there was more at stake in Latin American politics. It was more about the things like human rights and violence and democracy and dictatorship. And as ignorant as I was back then, and perhaps still am about the discipline, I really thought that nobody had studied Latin America in political science. I was like, well, I'm probably going to be the first one. And well, of course, I was wrong, but nonetheless, I simply switched to Latin American politics as my main object of study. Yeah.
Well, it was great that you did, because we're on here today to talk about Bolivia. And so before we talk about, what's going on in Bolivia and the election and Evo Morales and all these, the cast of characters that we have, can you give us a little bit of context about Bolivia? Because I think, like you, when you were first making the switch between studying domestic politics in Holland and switching to your focus to Latin America, I don't think me and Reese and perhaps others have a idea of what's actually going on in Latin America or Bolivia, because it's such a far and distant part of the world compared to where we are, is that we don't really have any clue really what's going on there, like any idea or any kind of context. So can you please, illuminate us?
Yeah, well, more generally, Latin America as a whole, it displays a huge variety in political history. Latin American countries, they differ hugely in terms of their previous experiences with democracy and dictatorship. And Bolivia is one of those Latin American countries that operates against a backdrop of an extensive history with dictatorship, right? So for the vast part of the 20th century, Bolivia was governed through non-democratic institutions and repression. And it wasn't until the 1980s that Bolivia gained its experience with what we might conceive of as democracy. So it's a country which still operates in the shadow of this extensive history with dictatorship, but it's also a country that at this point has also experienced several decades of democracy. And right now, it's been at the crossroads for some years now.
As Wynand, I've been practicing my Spanish all day today, and the characters like Evo Morales or Evo Morales. I hope that's okay. I've watched 6 hours straight of Dora the Explorer to prepare for this. But for anyone that's not aware, what is actually happening in Bolivia? Because I hear there's elections, and what is the big deal for anyone who's not aware of, and how and why is this happening?
Yeah. So there is an election coming up, October 18th, and that election will determine who will occupy the presidency. Now, Bolivia has been in a state of crisis ever since the previous presidential election that was held last year on October the 20th. And that was a contested election. Several political actors are still arguing about this and disagreeing about how free and fair that election was, and not just domestic political actors, including, of course, Evo Morales himself, but also all kinds of international actors. And political science has recently intervened as well, calling into questions some studies that have assessed the fairness of that particular election. So it was a contested election that was held last year, and in the wake of that contested elections, the several opposition forces in Bolivia opposed against the Morales government. They rose up. They initiated a mass movement of resistance, which was predominantly peaceful, but also incorporated some violent elements, and it forced the government to its knees, partly because the domestic security forces, the police and the military, suggested to Morales that he should step down. So that's what he did. Morales stepped down in November following several days of protest and following this big claim that the military made, which several domestic and international actors called a military coup. Morales resigned, and every conceivable successor or possible successor to Morales, they resigned as well. So as a result, a political vacuum emerged, and a senator, which is still the acting president, she stepped in and announced her willingness to take up the presidency. Now, according to the Constitution, it requires the appointment of the president in these circumstances requires the consent of Parliament. What happened was that the Mass Party, so that's Morales' party, all of its members of Parliament, they simply refused to show up in Parliament, as a result of which there were not enough parliamentarians to sanction and validate the appointment of this senator, Agnes, as president. So this too exacerbated the crisis. So the acting president, Agnes, too, is contested. So she might not be the president de jure, in the sense that she became president on the basis of questionable legal actions, illegal actions, but she's nonetheless de facto the president in the sense that the major political actors in Bolivia, except for the mass party of Morales, accept her rule, accept her as leader. And just a couple of weeks ago, the acting president, she announced that she would no longer serve as a presidential candidate. So she stepped out of the race. So her main task right now is overseeing the election and, of course, dealing with all these crises, including, of course, the corona.
So my understanding of it is that, unless you want to add to, is that the two kind of main characters so far that I've been reading about is that you have the former president, Evo Morales, as you mentioned before, and then now we have the interim president that is Janine Áñez. And are these the two main characters? Because as you said, she announced that she's no longer going to be running for president, but is Evo Morales planning to come back, or am I missing any other big actors in this Bolivian cast of drama?
Yeah, so the presidential election at this point is a two-way race. It might become a three-way race. So the main contender is the presidential candidate endorsed by Morales. So Morales is not running for office, not running for president. He is running for senator, but recently several branches of government in Bolivia have decided that he's not allowed to run for senator. So in January, Morales endorsed the presidential and vice presidential candidates for his mass party, his socialist party. And the presidential candidate, his name is Arce. So he's basically running for Morales' fourth term, in a sense that Arce, he agrees with Morales. He wants to continue his policies, and he's openly, of course, endorsed by Morales. And he's now leading in the polls. Just yesterday, a poll was released, according to which he now commands about 30% of electoral support across the entire country. Now, the runner-up, that's actually a former president. That's Mesa. But he was a former president. He was president about 15 years ago, and his party is a centrist party, a relatively new party. So he essentially wants to take apart the Morales legacy. According to Mesa, he wants to restore democracy. He wants to enhance the political independence of the judiciary, the Supreme Court. At the same time, he's very clear about how he would deal with Morales and his allies. And on several occasions, he has announced that if he would assume the presidency, he would initiate all kinds of investigations into the wrongdoings or the alleged wrongdoings of Morales and his allies. There is a third contender here, and that's Camacho. Now, he's on the far right. Camacho is a local politician in one of the relatively wealthy provinces of Bolivia, in the east of the country, and more specifically in Santa Cruz. He's been active in Santa Cruz, active in all kinds of far-right paramilitary political opposition groups that roam the streets, intimidate citizens, attack supporters of Morales, and, as happened during the crisis last year, beating up allies of Morales, using violence, burning government buildings, and being very clear about what he wants. He wants to get rid of Morales and the Morales regime, and he's prepared to use violence. So in the wake of that contested election, this Camacho leader, he rallied his troops, so to speak, rallied his members of this motorcycle gang led a civil uprising against Morales, and he rose to prominence in public discourse. He was a relatively unknown figure back then, but during the civil uprising, he emerged as the main opposition leader against the Morales regime, and he decided to exploit his rise to prominence and run for office himself. And he has about 20% or less than 20% of support in the polls. So he possibly might rise as the biggest alternative against the mass candidate. But things are still uncertain.
Speaking of uncertain, almost feels like politics in Latin America is super uncertain. And speaking of regimes, that is your bread and butter. It's like you being a striker in front of the home fans in the dikit, putting away a penalty there, Wynand. But when I look at the other countries in Latin America, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, they have hard left-wing regimes. And Bolivia almost became this under Morales. But for our listeners, what is a right-wing regime and what is a right-left? I'm getting my directions mixed up. A left-wing regime, or the other way. I've totally bamboozled my directions. But can you explain this to our audience, because it's very technical, and Nathan and you are experts at this. But for the general people out there who love their politics, can you explain this?
Yeah. So what makes left-wing regimes stand out is that they're fundamentally opposed against capitalism. Right? So capitalism is a system in which people who carry out the work are not allowed to keep what they produce. So if you are against that system, you are against capitalism. And throughout the 20th century, Latin American politics revolved around the question as to what to do with capitalism. So an alternative arose in Latin America. And that was socialism. It was a big alternative to this capitalist economic system in which people who would carry out the work would be allowed to keep what they produce, either because the state oversaw and directed the production of goods, or because workers themselves organized the production at the local in their local communities. Overall, this large-scale attempt by political forces on the left in Latin America, they failed, and that's because they were opposed by the right in Latin America, mainly those domestic forces, those political groups that were in favor of capitalism, that were in favor of a system in which landlords and capitalists, meaning those who own the stuff with which you can produce goods, many political forces on the right, they did everything they could do in order to eliminate, or at least severely weaken, left-wing groups. So this is where all these right-wing military dictatorships come into the picture. And over the course of the 1960s and 70s, several democracies in Latin America, in which these left-wing groups were active and quite powerful and relatively successful, were wiped out, were eliminated by the military, which came to power via military coups and remain in power for several decades. And Bolivia was one of those countries in which, in the 1960s, the military launched a coup and subsequently severely repressed left-wing political groups. So Latin America really was an arena in which what was at stake in politics the continuation of this capitalist system, in which capitalists, industrialists, and wealthy landowners would be able to exploit the labor of peasants and workers. And that system is still in place in Latin America. But it has been challenged recently, in recent decades, by left-wing regimes, such as those of Chavez and Evo Morales, to the extent that these economies became less capitalist and more dominated by the state.
So my understanding of what happened, you talked about how the right and the left, they are oppressing each other, but my understanding of Evo Morales is that he is on the left and that he rose to power democratically. And while he was in power, he was relatively popular with a lot of popular policies and eradicating poverty and things like that. But when we talk about Bolivia and all these different actors, it's a bit simplistic to say, but sometimes when we talk about countries, there are good guys and there are bad guys, right? The ones on the good side and the bad side. Like, how should we view this situation? Like, how should we see is it as clear cut as one person's a dictator and, the other one is fighting for democracy? But when I look at and read up about Evo Morales, he was quite popular at the start, but at the same time, he was trying to take control of the courts and other kind of dictator-like actions and policies like that. So can you describe to us, where does he stand in all of this?
Yeah, so let me start with a mainstream account of what is going on in Bolivia, what has been going on in Bolivia for the last several decades, and then complement that account with a slightly different perspective. So Bolivia became a democracy at the beginning of the 1980s. And throughout the 1990s, democracy was enhanced by offering more space for political actors at the local level to exploit democratic institutions. And this included several labor unions and mining organizations who championed the interests of miners and coca farmers that were offered these institutional channels of political influence. And Morales, who was a coca farmer and who was in charge of a political organization advancing and protecting the interests of coca farmers, he decided to exploit these democratic institutions, and he became very successful in this. So in 2002, he managed to enter parliament. That was 2002 was the year of the big parliamentary breakthrough for his socialist mass party. And in 2005, he won the presidential election, and he won them again in 2009 with a bigger mandate, and again in 2014. So he and his party handsomely won several presidential and legislative elections. And according to these mainstream accounts, what Morales did is he not just exploited these democratic institutions, right? Not just exploited free and fair elections, but he also subverted them in a sense that he used his power over and access to the resources of the state to weaken executive constraints. So to make sure that the judiciary would in effect become a loyal political ally, and to ensure that Parliament would no longer carry out its constitutional obligations to check the power of the executive. So as a result of the judiciary, in effect, no longer being and serving as an independent actor, and as a result of Parliament being less and less willing to constrain the executive, elections in Bolivia became less and less fair. It was less and less the case that elections operated against the backdrop of a of an equal level playing field, in which elections would will be fair, right? So one example of this is state resources, right? So the Morales government ensured that the bulk of state resources would be distributed in such a way that it would enhance the electoral prospect of this mass party, as opposed to the electoral prospect of all kinds of centrist and right-wing opposition groups. So Bolivia moved away from democracy and towards dictatorship. Now, this is not to say that Bolivia became a dictatorship, but it went in that direction, right? So in political science, we've got a plethora of labels that we can use to describe the Morales regime, or at least describe the regime that it became, right? So you could call this a hybrid regime or a competitive authoritarian regime. But whatever the label you use, about 10 years ago, Bolivia ceased to be a fully fledged liberal democracy. But to be clear, Bolivian democracy, it eroded not despite its previous democratic history, but exactly as a result of it, because it enabled the likes of Morales to exploit.
Wynand, some seem to suggest that this was a US-backed coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia. Now, I know the Organization of American States, OAS, it was a flawed analysis of the election, which fueled the destruction of Bolivia's democracy. But I've also read that the Morales fleeing to Mexico for political asylum has been labeled by some as a coup, or a popular uprising by others. So which is it?
Yeah, well, you have to be clear about how you would define a coup. So if a coup revolves around the use of violence, and the answer is no, or at least violence on the part of the military, and the answer is no. The military didn't violently overthrow the Morales regime, or Morales as president. Instead, it simply announced in public that Morales should resign. So at the very least, there is this latent threat of violence. So if that's what a coup is, if a coup also involves the threat or the latent threat of violence, then that's a coup. Right? But it's clear that what happened in Bolivia in October and November falls somewhere in between a coup and not a coup. So this too was subject of a big debate, not just in Bolivia, but throughout Latin America, because military coups, they used to be a frequent a method of political influence and control. So to see this happening again, or at least to acknowledge that this might have been the case in Bolivia in October, I mean, that sent shockwaves throughout the region.
I think the word coup is also such a loaded term in Latin America, where it kind of reminds me of, you look at kind of the political talk on the news or social media these days, where you got like, Donald Trump and the left, and you hear words like communism being thrown around very frequently, but maybe in Latin America, they throw around the word a coup as frequently too. I think maybe like the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, he throws around the word coup a lot, kind of as a way to kind of, I guess maybe, is it a way to protect themselves? Whereas like if they lose power, it's not because they lost support, but because it's a coup. It's someone else taking over, not illegally.
Yeah, absolutely, it's a loaded term. It speaks to the imagination. So all these political actors, left and right, democratic and non-democratic, they're competing over how to use that label coup and how to use the label of dictatorship.
Looking at Bolivia as a whole, though, and the coup, it almost appeared to me as a foreign term before looking into this, because you just can't imagine it living in Australia. But I could try and imagine, because of our problems in Australia with racism, and if it feels as though the situation in Bolivia with the coup seemingly being led by white elites, and looking at the history of racism and this being against Evo Morales, who is the first Indigenous president we must put out. What is the impact of being a first Indigenous president in Bolivia and dealing with the racism?
Well, it's huge. It's huge. So that's where I think an alternative perspective that first should come in, right? So the first perspective was that of these mainstream accounts, right? This left-wing political opposition party that exploited democratic institutions and then subverted it and weakened judges and weakened parliament, right? So this Morales, who took the parliamentary and electoral route to dictatorship. So that's the mainstream account. So let's look at the alternative account. Because the democracy that was introduced in Bolivia at the beginning of the 1980s was not just any kind of democracy. It's what political scientists call an elite biased democracy. It was a democracy that was governed by institutions that rig the political process in such a way that these institutions protect and advance the interests of powerful minorities, and especially those minorities that were in power in the previous dictatorship. So landowners, industrialists, and of course, the military. So how does this look like? Well, think of the fact that the constitution that was designed and imposed by the outgoing dictatorship is very hard to change, right? In fact, in 1994, additional changes were made to the Bolivian constitution that made it even harder for opposition groups to change the constitution. So the previous dictators and their ruling coalition, all these landowners and the owners of these mines, they simply designed the rules of the game. So it was a democratic game, but it was also a game that was tweaked in ways that made it very hard for opposition groups to introduce sweeping policy changes. Now, these features are not uniquely Bolivarian of democracy. You see them. You see them in several democracies, including the country in which I was born and raised, in Holland.
So I think the key point here, or the key takeaway for I think a lot of people, would be that when we think about democracies around the world, or even here in Australia or in the United States or in Holland, is that there are so many different kinds of democracies. It's not a single conception of democracy, where I think everyone has this idea or imagination of what a democracy is. But when you look at a country like Bolivia and you see, as you described, how they tweak the rules of how their democracy works, is that in every country, a democracy it works differently. And I think in Bolivia, their democracy was, I guess, kind of flawed because, like you said, the rules were kind of rigged for the elites or the landowners or the certain groups.
Yeah, those who owned the mines, they were able to exploit these institutions for years. So democracy became increasingly dysfunctional. So opposition groups they emerged at the local level, and one of these opposition groups was led by Morales, and he managed to become very good at exploiting these institutions, become very good at exploiting free and fair elections.
Can you tell us a bit about what exploiting free and fair, like you talked about exploiting institutions, can you give us maybe an example of what this actually means?
Yeah. basically setting up a political party and ensuring that that political party is able to make the most out of any given institution. So if the institution is free and fair elections, then that political party, if it wants to successfully exploit that kind of institution, it has to become very good at campaigning, mobilizing ordinary voters to the ballot box. And this is a hard thing to do. And that's because of what political scientists call collective action problem. It's very difficult to coordinate activities and pool resources, especially if you try to do so among those who have never been offered institutional access to these to democracy. So these indigenous groups in Bolivia, right? So they were severely repressed during these extensive spells of dictatorship, this extensive history of dictatorship in Bolivia. And once democracy was introduced, that democracy made it very hard for groups representing the indigenous population to advance their interests.
So I guess you would maybe draw comparisons to maybe, I think an easier comparison for people to, I guess, understand this idea would be maybe in America with the African American community, where there are all these, as we're seeing now, the movement of Black Lives Matter, is that it's not about just working hard or, not doing crime, but there are just so many layers of or barriers in how American society is that stops them from gaining power, being voted into office, and all kinds of things. And so I think, would that be maybe an accurate kind of point of comparison for people to understand how the indigenous Bolivian people have been repressed and therefore unable to, they find it very hard and difficult to get into power?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So the United States is one of those democracies that is characterized by all these counter-majoritarian features. Just think of the fact that several presidents, including Trump, lost the popular vote, but won the vote in the Electoral College. So you can win the elections without having won the most votes. Think of the Senate in the United States, where a majority of seats is determined by a minority in the population. Right. So it's a political system in which it's very hard for a popular majority to implement policy changes. So I think the United States is one of those examples. And the Constitution of the United States is very difficult to change, as is the case in Bolivia.
I would love to know, Wynand, through all your research and your studying over the years into regimes in Latin America, what are the biggest lessons that you've learned across your journey?
Well, this might sound very obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me, and that's that politics really changes over time. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that over time, organizations, they simply become very effective at exploiting particular institutions. And that's one of the reasons why institutions are so difficult to change, because once you change these institutions, then these organizations they become worthless.
Can you give us an example of this that's pertinent or that's relevant to what you're saying?
Yeah, so I think, for instance, of let's say the legal system in continental Europe. So it's based on Roman law. So back in undergrad, professors, they told me all the time that Roman law is so valuable because we're still practicing Roman law. At least we're still dealing with these legal systems that are based on Roman law. So this really exhibits the value, the enduring legacy. So this view is clearly wrong from a mainstream perspective. And that's because what matters is not so much these institutions, so these rules, this legal framework, but the organizations that try to make the most out of these rules, these institutions, that try to exploit them. So the reason why we're still using this legal system in Europe based on Roman law is not because these these legal systems are so valuable, but because the organizations European societies have set up ages ago have become so effective at dealing with Roman law that if we were to get rid of Roman law, these organizations would simply lose their value. Right? So if you would introduce an alternative legal system, that means you have to set up new organizations with zero expertise in this particular legal system. So the longer particular institutions are in place, the more difficult they are to change, because all kinds of organizations will tell you, well, no, please don't change these institutions. In fact, if you change these institutions, we're going to rise up against you. Right? So the longer that you have a particular practice put in place, the better you become at it, and therefore the less willing you are to change it. Let me give you another example. Let's take my dorm back in undergrad.
Wynand's audio kind of cut out here, but he basically said that his uni room in his dorm was basically a big mess. But anyway, back to the podcast.
So once you open the door, you have to watch your step. If you want to, let's say I would leave the keys at the other side of the room. I have to make a jump here, then reach to the left, and then watch for the dishes I had placed on the floor. And so it was a mess. But guess what? Over time, I became very good at dealing with that mess. I knew exactly where to jump, where to reach for the light, and where to put my keys.
Take notes, Nathan.
So maybe this example speaks to the imagination. It
definitely does to Nathan.
Okay, good. Well, I don't know.
Oh boy!
Came down to this, I became very good. I became very efficient at exploiting inefficient institutions. And people would say, "Please, could you just clean up your room? Because why would you do this to yourself? How could you find your keys? How could you, study effectively? Or how can you find your keys in this mess?" And I would always tell everyone, "So no, I know exactly how to make the most out of the situation, right? Because I got used to this, and I became very good at dealing with this." So that's an example where I thought that cleaning up my room would be a waste of time. Why? Because if I would clean up my room, then this skill of me, the skill I had of jumping here and then reaching to the left there, that particular skill would become useless. I would no longer be able to use that skill to get what I want. Now, of course, this is nonsensical. Of course, it's way better to clean up your room so that you don't have to engage in this arcane, strange practice and become good at this arcane practice. So this makes sense in this example, but guess what? This is the case in politics generally. Think of this rule that you have to vote on a Tuesday, right? So in the United States, voters, they vote on a Tuesday. Why Tuesday? Why Tuesday, right? It doesn't make any sense. It may make sense like 100 years ago, but nowadays, it doesn't make any sense. So why is this institution, why is this rule, why has it left unchanged? Well, that's because these organizations that have been set up, let's say Democratic Party and Republican Party, have become very good at exploiting that rule that says you have to vote on a Tuesday. So to go back to Latin America, what I've realized over the course of my research is that because organizations at some point become so good at dealing with particular institutions, that their way of their political behavior, the ways in which they advance their interests, changes over time as well. So we see a very clear trend, not just in Latin America, but across the world, where democracies collapse. They collapse increasingly by means not of a military coup, but by means of political actors who successfully embark on the parliamentary and electoral routes to power. So democracies collapse legally more so than through a violent military coup. So why is this the case? Well, my answer is still a tentative answer, and I'm still looking at this. And that's the reason is that those who oppose democracy have over time simply become very effective at exploiting democratic institutions. So why would you embark on a costly route to power? Why would you organize or try to organize a costly military coup if you can also exploit democratic institutions, if you can also win elections? Winning elections is hard, so it takes time for political groups to become very good at it. And that's exactly what these groups have been offered. They have been offered plenty of opportunities to simply, become very good at making the most out of democratic institutions. So that might be one explanation of why democracies collapse more or increasingly as a result of an autocrat or as a result of a politician with authoritarian ambitions, weakening executive constraints, right, sidelining parliament and judges, as opposed to those who come to power via violent military coup. Right, so the main approach to politics has changed over not through the mere passage of time, but because of the historically accumulated exposure of political groups, left and right, to democratic institutions, or at least electoral institutions.
Don't worry, Wynand. I'll make sure Nathan exploits that dishwasher with those dirty dishes.
The longer he's doing it, the better he at it. So there's hope for that. No, it's true that the longer you deal with let's say a mess, the better you come at it. So it's think of the way you organize your own work at school, right? So you don't want people to tell you how to study because you've been studying like this for years and it has worked. All of this is true. It does work. But what you in effect mean is that you've become very good at an efficient method of studying. You may have become more effective at studying, not so much because your method of studying is so effective, but because your ability to deal with an ineffective method has simply increased over time. So never, don't be tempted to say, well, this works, so I'm going to stick with that method. Always question the method that you're using.
I have a job interview soon, so I think I'll make sure to put this point in, even though that I'll question potentially ineffective and inefficient methods, and we'll make sure that we're always questioning it so that we're doing the most effective and efficient route to finish a task or a project or any kind of operation.
Yeah, well, do it. That's a very daring thing to say because this organization, they won't like to hear this because, they have rid of people who have become very good at dealing with that situation. So you're going to upset many people, but at least you're going to do something that is good for the benefit of all, right? So it's, and the same is true in politics, right? So those who want to change institutions, whether in the direction of democracy or in the direction of dictatorship, well, they face mounting, they face pressures from their opponents. Not so much because these opponents disagree with them. Well, they do, but because these opponents they want to keep these institutions intact because they're really good at making the most out of them.
Now I'm not so sure anymore if I should bring it up or say it anymore.
I hope we can speak soon, Wynand, because Nathan absolutely loves you. You can't see on the back wall on his right shoulder, but there is a massive poster of you. You are his favourite teacher.
Well, I'd like to think so, but...
But no, thank you very much for coming on and talking to us about Bolivia and breaking it all down for us. We wish to speak to you again sometime soon when something exciting happens again.
And we'll be watching those elections with interest. Yeah, definitely. Well, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the Glad You Knew Politics podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating and a review on what you thought about this week's episode, and any other questions you might have or issues you would like us to cover in future episodes. You can keep up to date with us and the podcast by following us at Glad You Knew on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Links are in the description below.